all for joining us today. It's a very exciting day for us seeing the book find its way out into the wider world. The book is called Restarting the Future, How to Fix the Intangible Economy, and it is our attempt to try and understand and offer some solutions for some big problems that we see in the world as relates to the economy. And I guess if we think about the economy, it's hard to look at the economy over the last 20 years and not be somewhat disappointed by what's happened. And one of the things we argue in the book is that the economy over the beginning of the century has been just generally disappointing and unsatisfactory in 5 disparate ways. We think this is something that many of these things will be obvious to economists, but some of them are even more obvious, dare I say it, to non-economists. The 5 things are as follows, talk a little bit about them: stagnation, inequality, dysfunctional competition, which I'll talk about, fragility, and a sense of inauthenticity. Stagnation is probably the most economicsy of these, if dare I say it. GDP per capita, the size of the economy, how prosperous we are. This is a line that it should have taken, that we thought was the trend line of growth. But since the early 2000s, before the financial crisis, not just in the UK, but in most rich countries, growth has disappointed us, and it hasn't really recovered back to that path. So a big problem to prosperity from a straightforward point of view. Of course, the gaps between the haves and the have-nots are also widely recognized to have grown. We see this is a famous chart by Branko Milanovic called the elephant chart. It looks a bit like an elephant. And basically, this shows the most wealthy people in the world, in Western societies, have done extremely well for a whole range of reasons. It's been okay if you live in the developing world. Developing world growth has been better than it historically was. But for less well-off people in the US, in Western Europe, things have been pretty bad. We also see this in incomes, and we see it in social status as well. I talked about this idea that competition seems to have been dysfunctional as well. A meme that you hear a lot about from economists is this idea at the top, the idea that the best firms in every industry and sector have pulled away from the rest, and you see monopolies emerging and people getting very concerned about that. But we call this sort of dysfunctional because there's something else going on as well that's quite strange. You would expect, potentially in a world where there were sort of large monopolies, for the life of managers and maybe even workers to be rather relaxed. This kind of idea of being fat, dumb, and happy because you can just relax if there's no competition. But actually, we're seeing a world where whether you're a worker in an Amazon warehouse or whether you're a kind of member of the ambitious elite, the rat race, how monitored you are, seems to have accelerated. So you have this weird coexistence of seeming monopoly and very frenetic life for everyone at an individual level. Moving away from the sort of traditional things that economists talk about, there's a growing feeling that the economy is rather fragile. Climate change and the idea that you can be as rich as you like, but if the planet is coming to an end, that there's a lot to worry about. That's been something we've rightly been worried about for quite a while. Just when we'd started writing this book, COVID-19 came along. We're now facing a geopolitical crisis in the Ukraine, and it seems that there's these threats to the economy seem to be somehow growing. And then finally, moving away from the hardcore economics, the idea that our economy somehow seems increasingly fake. This is something which, when I talk to people outside the discipline of economics, they recognize. The anthropologist David Graeber wrote a famous book called Bullshit Jobs, asking why do so many jobs nowadays seem to involve moving bits of paper around or doing things that don't seem very real. I'm a big fan of Call My Agent, the French Netflix show, but one of the interesting things about agents is, what do agents really do? They don't make the films. They just kind of negotiate claims between people. If you're Donald Trump, if you're Marine Le Pen, you talk about this world and you say, why don't people do real jobs anymore? There's a kind of genuine sense of something weird has changed and a lot of people aren't happy with it. This is a kind of a broad outline of what's going on. I'm going to hand over to Jonathan to talk about potentially some of the ways that people have otherwise tried to explain this. I have to hand over this baton.
This old-fashioned technology here. Apologies, everybody. You can see how unused I am to the physical world. So as Stian was saying, there are a host of these various difficulties, and we think that there are 2 quite common explanations which explain why it is that the economy has got the kinds of difficulties that Stian was just talking about. So the first one is on the left there for you. There's something about the bad conduct. Something's been going wrong. The other is it's just in the stars, circumstances, what can we do about it? A little bit more about this. Society, according to the first explanation, has somehow or other lost its way. Too much neoliberalism. There's, typically critics on the left say the difficulty is we've abandoned the economy to, the belief of weird economists and, right-wing individuals like allegedly associated with those kind of points of view. And there's just been too much of that liberalism. Interestingly, of course, there's also a debate on the other side, which is that there's just not enough liberalism going on. There's not enough risk-taking going on. There's a decline in dynamism, and something's gone wrong, that the economy essentially is over-regulated, and there should be more freedoms to do the kind of unrestricted capitalist activities that the previous group just don't like. Now, the other sort of set of explanations around circumstance over on the left there is essentially that there's just something happened about which we can do nothing. Technological progress has simply slowed down. So those of you who might have read the economist Bob Gordon from Northwestern University has tried to argue that essentially the history of technology in the world is what he calls one big wave, which is to say the world got lucky in the Industrial Revolution, got lucky as well with the ICT revolution, which kind of carried that on. That's all over. And we're just stuck with low growth now, and we just have to get used to it. So the fact that productivity growth has now gone back to the kind of growth that we saw in the 1850s, well, that's just what we've got to put up with, a permanent kind of steam age, or pre-steam age even. Now, we have a sort of different view. It's around institutions. But before I say that, let me take you through why it is that we come to that different view with an illustration. So we go back to 1700. Here's Winstanley's Eddystone Lighthouse. So this is a lighthouse off Plymouth here. Remember, at the time of Britain as being an important maritime nation, this was an incredibly important supply route, and many ships were wrecked around this area. There's a sort of stretch of rocks outside of Plymouth Harbour, which are very treacherous for shipping. And the Admiralty had wanted a lighthouse to be built there, well, for years and years and years. And Winstanley put one up around 1700. It didn't last very long, unfortunately. So what have lighthouses got to do with anything? So in the 1850s, Britain decided that we were a technological laggard. So this notion that countries can be a technological laggard is hardly a new one. And a royal commission was appointed. So for those of you not familiar with UK institutions, a commission of inquiry to look into what things is one thing. But in Britain, we have a royal commission. That's like a really big thing. And the Royal Commission, 1851, here's the document here that you can read, compared Britain's technological backwardness about lighthouses with the French, and was particularly irritated to find that Britain was particularly technological backward with regards to France. Here are some facts on the right-hand side. One lighthouse per 12 miles of shore in France. The UK had one lighthouse per 29 miles of shore, so it was underprovided. French and indeed American lighthouses, so this is again in the 1850s, had modern technology. Britain had lagging technology. And so the question then is, why the most richest, the most maritime country, as I say at that time there, was lagging behind quite so badly? And the reason we think is that technology, as it says on the next slide here, needs the correct institutions. So let me walk you through this argument in the following way. How did it work? In Britain, on the top right there, as it says, lighthouses were primarily funded by local harbour fees. So if you sailed past the lighthouse, you sailed into the harbour, you paid your harbour fees, and the lighthouse took a chunk of those fees. That's just a private sector arrangement, right? We just delegate that to the private sector, and if the private sector wants to put up a lighthouse in a particular harbour, good luck to them. Leaving those kinds of things to market forces is the kind of thing which will extract the information about where the right lighthouse is going to be. So as it says on the second point there, it's a great system, this private ownership, for experimentation, where to put them, where to put the lighthouses, where to have new techniques. The French, however, had invented the Fresnel lens, and the Fresnel lens is a picture of it over there. What essentially that was, it was a series of prisms which concentrated the light. And what was brilliant about that invention is it meant the light could go much, much further. So previously, the point about lighthouses is they cast very little light. And so the fact that they were at the mouths of ports made sense because boats were sailing past them. Once these lighthouses cast much more light with this new French invention, then the lighthouse became a different phenomenon, as it says on the right. Says there, they made lighthouses use to far-off ocean-going ships. Now, the trouble with those ocean-going ships is it was pretty hard to get them to pay for the lighthouse. So what France had is they had, as it says on the bottom there, the French had a centrally directed system where there was a levy on ships, there was funding of lighthouses from general taxation. It's a very kind of centralized way of doing it. The complete opposite institution from the decentralized market-based system, which had proved very successful when the lighthouse illumination was very poor. But once technology had changed, then that institution became unfit for purpose. And in this particular case, one needed a more centralized institution. So that notion of institutions being the right fit when technology changes is what we're about. So what is the technology change now? It's much broader than just the invention of more efficient ways of illuminating shipping. And it is, so the last point there, as I was just saying, that broader invention is the change to the modern economy. So in what way has the modern economy changed? And as David Brown was saying kindly in his introduction, this is what we discussed in the previous book. Here are the world's top 10 companies, according to PwC, who rank these companies by their market value. This is in 2021. And if you look at those top 10 companies, you'll be familiar with lots of those companies: Apple, Saudi Aramco, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, Facebook. These will be incredibly familiar companies to you. Now, what are the assets of Saudi Aramco? So Saudi Aramco is much in the news, obviously, the Saudi Arabian oil and gas company. There's a picture of their assets. They are very tangible things. They're the oil wells, they're the pipelines, they're the shipping and all the complicated vehicles they've got to get all this stuff out of the ground. A very tangible kind of business. But those other businesses up there don't look tangible at all. They don't have lots of big oil wells and big amounts of tangible equipment. What they've got is they've got something very different, and we think that they've got these very intangible assets. So here's an excerpt from, this is word one. This is actually the dictionary from the bit of software that is the dictionary from the very first version of Word. And that's what Microsoft's assets are. And so you can see in that picture there, those assets are just very different to the kind of assets that you see that Saudi Aramco have got. And they're very intangible assets. Let's just run through those types of intangible assets. And those of you who heard our previous talk will be familiar with this. On the left-hand side are the kind of tangible assets I just mentioned that Saudi Aramco have: buildings, computers, plant machinery, and vehicles. On the right-hand side are the intangible assets, which these different companies have: the Microsofts, the LinkedIn, and so forth. What kind of assets are they? They're much more knowledge-based assets. They're assets that you can't touch, you can't feel, much more intellectually based. R&D, training, design, development of organizations, brands and marketing, artistic originals. There's a picture of Harry Potter there. If you're wondering where Harry Potter, Britain's most famous invention, comes into this, it comes there. And there's software and data, all areas, of course, that the different departments in the business school are extremely interested in. But for us, it comes under this heading of intangible assets. Now, what we documented in the earlier book, and a lot of research work has been gone into this, is that the nature of that change from the tangible intensive economy, that is the blue line, which you can see tangible investment as a proportion of GDP has been going down somewhat. The red line is the intangible intensivity of the economy. So this is intangible investment as a proportion of GDP, which you can see has steadily been going up. But, and here's the big thing which our sort of book is trying to build on, that change has been somewhat interrupted. It's slowed, essentially. So before I talk about that, let me just say again about how this interrelationship between the type of the economy and the type of institutions works out. The way we manage intellectual property, fund R&D, regulate competition, finance business, cities, monetary policy, all those kind of things we think were developed in a tangible era. And we want to change those things and see how they're fit for a more intangible era. Now, as I mentioned, the transition to an intangible economy, we think because of these institutions which don't serve us so well, has slowed. So the black line gives you real investment in intellectual property in the US. So this is quarterly data. This is all the way up to 2021 Q4. So this is the most recent data we've got. And you'll see a couple of things. The first thing you see that the US have been steaming ahead. They had fairly high growth. It's indexed 2007. They had fairly high growth before then, and then they've been steaming ahead. And one thing we haven't mentioned COVID at all, on the top right part of the diagram are the quarters over COVID. And actually, there appears to be additional investment in intangibles over COVID. So we think, if anything, intangible investment might have become even more relevant over COVID. The blue line is the UK. And as you can see, the UK was growing more slowly. And then after 2007, it slowed down. And in particular, it slowed down around 2016. So I said we hadn't mentioned COVID, we haven't mentioned Brexit. So the Brexit vote was around 2016. That appears to have been associated with a slowdown in general in investment. And so there appears to be an effect there. Okay, so the wrong institutions, which are slowing down this type of intangible investment. Let me just summarize then why we think that these 5 problems that Stian talked about are explained by intangibles, and I'll hand back to Stian for a minute or two. Real quick, and Stian's going to talk more about this. The kind of stagnation that we've seen is because intangible investment, we think, has been held up. The kind of inequality, the dynamics between different firms, some firms have done well, some firms have done badly. The firms who've done well have built on intangibles, the other ones have been left behind. The kind of competition that we've got, the strong segregation into winners and losers, we think is related to what I just said, some firms scaling up over the intangibles that they have. The fragility that we've seen, climate change, COVID and all of that seems like a very tangible thing, but it turned out, we think, to be much more intangible. And then authenticity, inauthenticity, what are those people doing on those kind of TV programs that Stian was talking about? Maybe they're arranging these intangible assets. So let me pass over to Stian just for 10 more minutes to say something about those different categories.
Thank you, Jonathan. I guess I'm going to skip to then the second half of the book. Basically says, well, we've got this problem. It's got something to do with this transition to intangibles. What do you do about it? How do we change these institutions so that we can refresh them and update them for a new economy? And there are a few things that we talk about. We talk first of all about what are some principles for good institutional design? How do you make good institutions for this new type of economy? And then we go into some examples of what we can change. And there are sort of 3 little stories that will help think about what should be done in this area. I'll talk about them quickly in turn. Wheelie suitcases and rocket ships is one story. And these are kind of 2 emblematic sorts of innovation, both sort of heavily based on intangible investments. On the left, the invention of rocket ships, the invention of the Apollo space program. On the right, a more mundane but very commercially profitable invention, the invention of the wheelie rollerboard suitcase. Also very significant, but quite different in its type. Some inventions, we argue, are a bit like the Apollo program. What really matters is spending a really, really large amount of investment on intangibles, on things like R&D and on design to deliver a big complex goal. To make that happen, businesses are not going to do this kind of investment on their own for the most part because the benefits spill over. You're not going to make a lot of money designing rocket ships unless NASA will pay you to do it. So you have to have some kind of credit. And basically, these from an economics point of view, this capital is sort of homogeneous. All that matters is the quantity rather than some specific aspect of it. The rollerboard suitcase looks very different. What matters here is the variety of innovations. So the rollerboard took 2 totally mundane ideas, the little wheel and the suitcase, and combined them in a way that created a hugely valuable new product. To make this work, you need really efficient markets so that if you come up with a product, people will buy it. And one way of thinking about this kind of capital is it's very heterogeneous. It's not just about putting any 2 ideas together. You've got to put the right 2 ideas together. And this touches on a kind of an ancient debate among economists and an economist called Ludwig Lackmann, who sort of speculated that capital in some senses might be heterogeneous. And thinking about these in different ways illuminates different ways of how you might design institutions. A different paradox is the paradox between how do you keep your institutions honest versus how do you keep them agile? One of the sort of standard problems of governments since the beginning of history is how do you stop governments and the institutions they create self-dealing, basically cheating and lining their own pockets at the expense of the public that they're meant to serve. This can happen even when people are not themselves very dishonest. A lovely example is the way we set interest rates in the UK between the Second World War and Tony Blair's time. What used to happen, the government basically controlled the interest rate, and in the run-up to election, there was a huge temptation for them to lower interest rates, so the economy would boom, people would vote for the government. That was great in the short term for the politicians, but was terrible in the long term because the economy kind of jumped up and down a lot. So the question is, how do you reduce the temptation for government to do these things? And the traditional way is you make lots of rules so that the people who run these institutions don't have very much discretion. So Gordon Brown made the Bank of England independent and told them that you were only allowed to do inflation targeting. So it was a lot harder to mess around with the rules for political reasons. Some political scientists, Milgram and Roberts, basically formalized this and said, well, rules are really good because they stop you doing bad things. Now, but there is a problem with this, and there's a problem in particularly when circumstances change. As Jonathan pointed out, they might recently have done in respect of intangible capital. So there's a sort of great classical story of how Odysseus lashed himself to the mast of the ship so the sirens would not divert him and make him sail into the rocks. And that's a little bit like setting an independent central bank. It kind of limits your discretion. But of course, Odysseus didn't spend the whole of the Odyssey lashed to the mast of his ship. It would have been a very boring book and probably would have been eaten by a cyclops or something. There is a trade-off here. When circumstances change, these rules are not very responsive. So if you have this kind of algorithmic approach, you're not going to be able to respond to these kind of challenges. So you need to work out how do you balance the need for honesty versus agility. And then finally, when things change, there are generally winners and losers in society. And if you give the people who lose out from a change the opportunity, they will do what they can to stop the change. And very often they form powerful interest groups that can block things. This is going to be relevant when we talk about planning. Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom worked on the economics and politics of fisheries and looked at how these organizations could self-organize to solve some of these problems. And one of the really interesting lessons from looking at this literature is that good institutions allow deals to be done so that people who lose out can be compensated by people who win. And that's another, for us, important principle of institution design when things are changing. So then the rest of the book, we say, okay, well, what does this practically mean? How do you fix these kind of problems? And we talk about 4 areas that we think are not fit for purpose in the current world. How we invest in research, knowledge, education, how we lay out the cities that we live in and do planning policy, how we govern the competition between firms, which we said looks pretty broken at the moment, and what we call financial architecture, the systems that get money from savers and investors to businesses to help them grow. And just sort of quickly, what we go into on those kind of things, funding science, technology, and education becomes extremely important in an intangible economy because, like the Apollo example, you want to put money towards good projects. But a lot of the systems we have at the moment are very automatic. They're very rules-based. I'm sure there are some academics in the audience who have to deal with what gets called the metric tide, you know, the urge to just publish lots and lots of papers with quantity sometimes being privileged over quality. Not obviously an august institution like Imperial, but anyway. And anyone who's had to deal with patents and copyrights, I see some authors in the audience as well, know that these systems are heavily lobbied by rights holders and other dodgy characters. Our recommendation here, first one, just spend more money on public research. This is really important. It's somewhat flavor of the month among policymakers, but double down on it. More interestingly, we think there's a real opportunity to experiment with new ways of funding research. Maybe do it with less bureaucracy. There are some really interesting methods of doing this, like lottery funding, or the kind of model used at somewhere like the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which trusts researchers more. There's also some really interesting models coming out of places like Silicon Valley, where rich tech guys are backing private versions of ARPA, the US Defense Agency, to really look at interesting mission-related research. But we need more experimentation because the quality, thinking back to the wheelie suitcase, really matters more. And one of the things this really relies on is what sometimes gets called state capacity. Government's got to get smarter at how to do these kind of things in organizations like research funding agencies and patent agencies, which in the past have sometimes been quite sleepy places. Financial architecture. One of the challenges of financing intangible businesses is that our financial system, for the most part, relies on bank financing, on debt financing, which is great if businesses have assets that banks can take as securities. But in a world where you have intangible assets, which are worth less when a business goes bankrupt, you have what some economists have called the curse of collateral. The fact that because businesses can't pledge these intangible assets as collateral, you have a system where our main type of finance is no good for a lot of businesses. We also have a challenge where UK pension funds tend to be too small and too low skilled to invest in funds that invest in intangible assets. I know that's a big issue for a lot of venture capital and private equity funds. Venture capital is helpful, but it's pretty niche in the UK at the moment. And we have a financial regulation system that makes it hard for institutions to back these kind of things. And you have an interesting trend here, which is that if you look, the blue line is 1982, banks used to invest rather a lot in what are called non-financial corporates, real businesses, if you want to call them that. Now, everything has gone towards mortgage lending because that's where the real assets are in the economy that banks can take claims on. And that is pretty depressing for the economy. We think a big part of this is actually just governments caring about this. This is, we've both spent a lot of time working in government. This isn't really anyone's job, and it should be. There's a big political win in ending the tax bias towards debt and away from equity. That's a nice 10-year political campaign for someone to fight. We could do more reporting and better financial analysis on intangibles. There's a big issue there. And I would love to see the regulation of pension funds reformed so that you can get more money from our savings and investments going into some of this high return risk capital, which makes sense if you do it at scale. When it comes to competition, there's a meme out there that's very dominant both in the UK, the rest of Europe, and in the US, that the reason why concentration in the economy, big business, has increased is that the regulators of competition have somehow taken their foot off the gas. In the old days, we used to be much tougher at breaking up monopolies. And this has given rise to Margrethe Vestager, the European Commission Competition Commissioner. This is Lena Khan, who runs the Federal Trade Commission in the US. The UK has set up a digital markets unit. And the flavour of the month in policy world is to say, well, we need to just really get tough on competition policy, break up Facebook, break up Google, and do this kind of thing because we've eased up too much. And our argument is, well, this is a pretty incomplete version of the story. Because if you look at, this is another way of measuring concentration. If you look at the concentration in industries, in low intangible sectors, it hasn't really increased that much. Where the increase has come is in these intangible intensive sectors. And that's because these intangible assets are very valuable when you combine them. And they exhibit great returns to scale. So what we're saying is this is probably not a sign that regulators have become dodgy or captured. It's a sign that the economy is changing and our regulation methods haven't caught up to it. So a few things we think we could do to that. The first thing is you would expect in this economy to see things a little bit like what biologists would call a punctuated equilibrium model, where dinosaurs rule the world for a period and then they get wiped out by a meteorite and then mammals rule the world. You want a world where you tolerate large businesses for a while, but you have a system where new firms can scale up, enter markets quickly, and challenge them. This probably means you need a lot more tech expertise among regulators. The interesting idea that's been proposed is what's called the M+1 regulator, a regulator with tech expertise who can just understand in many different industries what you need to ensure that new entrants can enter. And a broader suggestion is we talked about how the rat race seems to be accelerating, and there feels like there's a kind of an acceleration of people having to do potentially not very useful academic courses in order to get qualifications to signal that they're smart. That might be a better type of competition for governments to spend political capital on, rather than fighting endless wars to try and break up Facebook. That's not necessarily important. We then go on to talk about planning and cities and clusters are really where the intangible economy happens. It's where ideas get mixed together. The benefits of being in a place like San Francisco or Boston or London or in a cluster like Cambridge have increased very significantly in the intangible economy. But our planning system was mostly designed, the UK planning system was designed in 1948 when no one really cared about this stuff and it wasn't as economically important. So it makes it very hard to grow and to build new houses, which increases prices. And interestingly, it also means that people who are not highly skilled and highly paid can definitely not afford to move to where good jobs are. And if we think back to some of the cultural problems, that creates a lot of division in society because it means that if somewhere like, let's say, Cambridge, a small, very high-tech place, is doing really well, the only people who benefit from that are a sort of educated elite. Some cultural problems as well as economic problems there. The normal way of fixing this is to say, well, let's build on the green belt. Let's just build more houses. But as anyone who's followed this area knows, that is a political quagmire. You're going to make less progress there than the Russian army. This is a kind of terrible way of trying to proceed politically. homeowners get no benefit from development, so they vote against it. This is why people say, you know, not in my backyard to planning developments. We have a solution that's inspired by some of these things that we were saying Eleanor Ostrom talked about, which is to try and localize the decision so that individual areas, individual blocks, individual streets can vote on these things so that they get more of the benefits, and losers, people inconvenienced by development, can get the benefit. And we think that's a possible way of trying to fix this. There's a lot more in the book, plenty of anecdotes, lots of examples, some of them even drawn from our own experience of policy, central banking, and so forth. But we're really excited to release this into the world, and we hope that it offers some ways to try and change government, business, investing, so that we have a more healthy, a more equal, and a fairer economy. We're going to finish there, but we'd love to have questions, discussion, and to chat about the book more. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Delighted to be here leading on in some of the Q&A on this very interesting presentation. And thank you, Jonathan and Stian, and also David for leading us here. So I'll start with a few questions, but then the idea, is also to involve you. And so start thinking about your own questions if you haven't so far with this very stimulating presentation that we've had until now. So the first question that I have is a little bit related to kind of like the connection point that you already made between the old book and kind of the new book. And so, as you said, this is a reflection that you started with the old book about the rise of the intangible, and you presented, one of the compelling graphs that you had on the other book here as well. And you started to lead off on, how this has implications in terms of policy and decision making. But I guess the question is more about kind of like, what have you learned from the other book to this in terms of, as something shifted from your understanding of the other book and as you worked on this, and so some new elements emerged, or is this more about kind of reflecting on the implications? So how do you define the two and the evolution on the reflection on these two interrelated elements?
Shall I have a start at that, Francisco? So I think we had a series of, so let me tell you what we think we got right in the other book, and then Stian will tell you what we got wrong, and then namely the slowdown and so forth. What I hope we got right in the other book was some of the properties of intangibles that we've mentioned I think have come to help us understand some of the things which are going on in the world. So for example, the fact that once Uber, for example, writes an algorithm, it can scale up that algorithm, and you can, Uber your way to, in the days when we were flying around, you could Uber your way to Heathrow, and you could fly to New York and then Uber your way back from, when you're in New York, you're using a similar algorithm. So that's scale up. I think those kinds of sort of properties of intangibles of making firms big and enabling firms to expand. Subsequent research, as we showed up on the screen there, seemed to confirm that indeed, in the areas where there are lots of intangibles, those firms really did scale up. And so therefore, the gap between the leading firms and the laggard firms seemed to correspond a lot with the intangible intensive kind of areas. So some of the things that we sort of conjectured there, I hope later research has shown that turned out. But the thing that we sort of didn't get at all was this slowdown that there seemed to be in intangibles. I don't know, Stian, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, this was a really interesting surprise. And in fact, so when we were writing the first book, when we were looking at how intangibles had grown, we had this chart that showed they'd kind of grown steadily. And then in the kind of just the very last couple of years of the data that were available back in 2017, the line kinked down, and we thought, oh, God, what's happened? Has this trend that we're writing a book about suddenly stopped? And we just thought, well, it's just a year or two's data. You never quite know. We'll just write the book and it'll probably come out in the wash. So we did. And then, you know, as we watched it over time, we saw in some countries, as we've seen in the UK and some others, goodness me, this line really did start, so the growth did slow. Some countries, it kind of carried on. And we also saw this in some businesses as well. There were some industries that just weren't getting intangibles. And that started us thinking, well, okay, what's going on here? What is meaning that this kind of change that's going on in the world is in some places slowing down? And that's what got us into thinking about institutions, thinking about what the gaps was. So in some ways, I'm glad that we missed that the first time, because it set us thinking in an entirely new direction.
Okay, and so the second question that I wanted to ask kind of relates to, in some ways, the stability of perspectives or theories or ideas about what's changing the world. I mean, and that's, you know, in some ways, we wish that that was not the case because of the impacts that it has. But in some ways, I think it's very helpful when you have these kinds of reflections, and that has to do with the shocks to the economy, right? So you thought about the previous book, also on the rise of the intangible, you know, pre-pandemic. You know, since then we've had a pandemic, now a war that's, you know, affecting certainly what's happening in the Western world and Europe in particular. You know, two, you know, terrible situations in different ways. So think about mega shocks to the economy. How does this, you know, how has this, you know, shocked your, you know, own reflections on this, the rise of the intangibles and the way to fix it? Did it help sediment some elements? It raised new ones? It affected? So what a little bit on that bit?
Shall I? So, I mean, this comes back to this issue of fragility that we talked about. And what I found fascinating, so I'll talk maybe a bit about COVID-19 and what happened when that started. I think what we see is, in many of these instances, people's first reaction is, goodness me, something big and bad has happened. And this is going to show that all this intangible economy stuff is nice to have, but it's not really what matters when it comes to the crunch. So when COVID-19 started, that seemed a very physical challenge. And we thought, well, you know, what's this going to show? But what I thought was fascinating is over the first few weeks of COVID, there was a real change in public perception about what actually really mattered. And that change was from tangible stuff to intangible stuff. So by way of example, if you think back to kind of February, March 2020, the kind of panics that I recall going on were, we were worried we wouldn't have enough ventilators in the UK. If people remember Nightingale hospitals, there was this, people were looking at China that were building these enormous hospitals, and goodness me, the toilet paper. But there was this idea that, you know, the decadent West would not be able to kind of rise to the challenge of building all this physical infrastructure. And what we ended up seeing was that the things that really mattered in terms of coping with COVID were vaccine R&D, first and foremost, classic intangible. You know, the COVID vaccines are probably the most valuable intangible asset that's been created in the last few years. It was a lot of the kind of soft social norms about how do you work out what the right NPIs, the right non-pharmaceutical interventions are, and how do you persuade people to actually do them. It was things like test and trace systems, which have a bit of physical capital, but are mostly software, data, and systems. So it was a kind of world where we thought that kind of the tangible world would be kind of the nemesis of the intangible world. But it turns out that actually it was the intangibles that really mattered.
Yeah, just to add, you mentioned, Francisco, about the war. Look, the first point about the war is it's a humanitarian crisis, you know, and all of our sympathy are with the people of Ukraine. So I don't want to sound crass here. It's too easy for economists to sound a little bit crass. But if I can just a little economics angle on this, again, to stress, this is a small side of this. It seems quite likely that military expenditure is going to be much more important as a consequence of this. You know, the equilibrium amount of national income we're going to have to spend on defense is probably going to go up. Defense expenditure has stopped being expenditure on sort of poorly paid, poorly trained soldiers with boots on the ground. It is much more capital intensive, and some of that capital is very tangible capital, the rockets and the missiles and all that kind of thing as well. An element of it is actually, perhaps unfortunately, intangible as well, the software, the kind of guidance systems and so forth. And there's an active issue, I think, in trying to understand whether the necessary extra expenditure we're going to have to make on those issues might have maybe some beneficial spillover effects. Some of the, software writers and so forth from the military in Israel, for example, have made a transition and developed peaceful applications and so forth. So I think, as I say, not to be too crass about it, but I think there's an angle about thinking about the future of the war and the future of the type of expenditure, the changes that we're going to have to live with, and seeing whether those can trace their ways in possibly beneficial ways through the economy.
Thank you, and thank you for mentioning that, because of course, the war, it's affecting us all, and it's shifting a variety of ways that we think about that, and I think, as you said, of course, the first responsibility is on the humanitarian side. So firstly, the lost lives that we're seeing, but also the huge humanitarian crisis that we're witnessing all around Europe, and with the refugees. Particularly impressed with the number of children that have been displaced and moving, which is just terrible. And I'm sure there will be, very interesting reflection later on at some point, hopefully, when we're able to have this war in a different stance, also in the reconstruction of a country, which is a novel, situation that we have on the way that we think about capital and intangible infrastructure. My last question, and I'm going to hand it back to all of you in a second, related to the inequality part. You mentioned that in the presentation, but I'd like to ask if you could delve a little bit more on that, in the sense that, if indeed we're able to fix through institutions, as you were mentioning, some of these elements of the way that we regulate these intangible investments, it was not apparent to me how that helps solve the inequality element, because what we know also is that the access to some of the opportunities relates to the difficulty that people have investing or accessing some of these intangible elements. You spoke a little bit of that on the city side, so perhaps that's certainly one angle that I think that it addresses that directly. But I just wanted to understand, whether there are other elements beyond the cities part that you were exploring, because I feel that that's quite important from the everyday person point of view, in terms of the implication of your work and the way that we think about, in some way, the urgency of fixing this. What's going to be the implication down the line for the average person, as opposed to the people that are kind of like on the extremes of these. And so,
shall I say a little bit about the financing? Just a couple of things on the finance side, because Francisco, I think it speaks to your nice question about, can an individual start a business? What are the opportunities for them to come in and try and knock these existing businesses, off their perch? So a couple of things on that. Firstly, Ramana Nada is sitting at the front here, who's the great expert on financing of new businesses and so forth. So I hesitate to talk in front of him, but just to have my tuppence worth, since I happen to have the floor. As I mentioned in the presentation, as Stian mentioned as well, it's often very difficult for firms to go and borrow against an intangible asset. If you've got a tangible asset like a house or something like that, the bank will lend you some money. If you've got an intangible asset like a movie script or a design or an idea or something like that, it's much more difficult. So we see a couple of things. One thing we see is that increasingly there is a sensitivity of intangible investment to the value of the small business owner's house. So some econometric work that I've done with colleagues at the Bank of England shows this. You can match together the small business owner through the registry of directors with the value of their house, and you find that and Ramada, I think, has done some work on this in Denmark, I believe, as well. So this duplicates that for the UK. You find that, guess what, gyrations in house prices seem to affect the amount of money that small business owners can raise in intangibles. So that makes the economy particularly susceptible, I think, to the whims and the whys and the wherefores of the housing market. I think that's one set of issues. And the other set of issues is the broader set of issues about whether it is that pension funds and so forth are allowed to, by means of regulation, to invest in a broader class of assets than they're currently allowed to. And one last thing, which again, Ramana has worked on, which we feature in the book, is that my understanding from your work, Ramana, is that it's actually quite difficult for these venture capitalist companies to start investing in intangible assets beyond the IT sector. So if we want them to invest in climate and all those kinds of things, seem to be much less well suited to investing in those kind of areas than they are in the IT sector. So even that workaround, you might say, oh, well, we could work around this and have more venture capital. Well, that's only going to take us so far.
I mean, I think the broad point you make is really important. These dynamics of intangible assets increase inequality, and, you know, governments, voters have a choice. You either have to accept high levels of inequality, or you have to tax more, you have to redistribute more to remedy that. I think that's a sort of brute fact of this this change. I think there are probably some things that we can do to try and to stop trying to make it worse, if that makes sense. So we talked earlier about how in this economy, where it really matters to be in a sort of to be able to trade off different intangibles, where some of these jobs become more important, that there is a risk that you get more signaling in the form of education. So everyone's familiar with the fact that, you know, once upon a time there were a lot of jobs that didn't require a degree, then a lot of them required a degree. Now often they require a master's degree, not necessarily because it adds any sort of human capital, but because you want to show that you're the smartest, most conscientious person. I think there's some interesting kind of groping around by governments around the world to try and stop that, to try and say, how can we make sure that, for example, higher education is really about human capital formation, and that we're not creating a rat race where people are just spending more and more of their money and years of their lives on this kind of thing. I think some of that stuff at the margin would help, but ultimately we're faced with a choice where either inequality is going to increase or we're going to have to put in place more policies to fix it.
All right, thank you. So opening it up to you, John. I'll repeat the question. Go ahead and.
Yes, so thank you so much for the panorama of such complex issues. Amazing. I want to talk about one little point. Stian talked about bad conduct being one of the drivers. And I was, later on, neither of you mentioned the issue of corruption and integrity as being a negative driver for progress. And we're talking about government actors and corporate actors acting with impunity for their own self-interest as opposed to the public interest. And we see it every day in the newspapers. Millions of well-established institutions are involved in doing bad things. And I was just wondering if we could add to the mix of things to be done. What can be done to start in a, maybe even in a small way, to start stopping this, because it'll get in the way of every solution.
Thank you very much. So first question about, you know, corruption and how that connects and helps, actually prevents some of this development. I think I'm going to collect 2 or 3 questions and then we'll get back to you. So any other question? Yes.
And I'm wondering about data privacy. So I guess you would say, or I mean, we know that it's kind of harming the victims like Facebook and so on. Would you say it's good to cut it down, and then also what would benefit from the cost of that we cut down on the data privacy?
Very interesting question about, you know, as very important part of what's rising on this intangible investment is data and the value of data, and therefore how to think about the privacy question on the middle of this. I think is a very interesting question. Then we have Tommaso.
Thank you so much. I have a question. In your first book, you told us that the way firms compete has changed in a very fundamental way because of the time. In your second book now, you're telling us that institutions should change as well, adapt to this change. I was wondering, maybe it's going to be the topic for your third book, but what can we do as citizens in all this? And in particular, since we are in a university, what can our students do to restart their future?
Thank you, Tommaso. That's a very, very interesting question. So I think perhaps I'll go around, say you can address these 3 questions, then I'll make another round so that we just don't pile up the number of questions. So, you know, I don't know who wants to start.
Well, let me try on the data privacy issue. So this is, I think, is one of these very tricky areas where the law of unintended consequences might hold. So one of the issues on data privacy is that if you some of these GDPR style regulations, which compel people to reject cookies and this, that, and the other, though people can, there is a private sector solution, which is to have ad blockers. And it turns out that the research, as I understand it, indicates that the people who have the ad blockers are the people who also pay attention and reject all the cookies and so forth. And the trouble with that is that has the unintended consequence of then improving the information that these that the people who are monitoring the internet can have of the people who don't take any of those steps. So it spills back over to those other areas. So I think it's another area, Stian mentioned this a little bit, where in the sort of tech area, which is moving fast, has a new set of challenges, there's a lot of expertise required, and state capacity was the word that Stian used, to make appropriate judgments of these difficult kinds of trade-offs.
If I can sort of try and combine an answer to Tomas's question and John's question, I think one thing that's interesting about this economy, there is a story that people tell about the current economy that says that what students and other young people should be doing to thrive is they should learn to code. They should learn science and technology skills because technology is the future. And, you know, clearly a lot of people in places like Imperial are doing that. Although it's not unimportant, we think that actually one of the really interesting characteristics of this economy is because of the greater interconnectedness and because so much of what goes on is about combining different intangibles together in novel ways, one of the most valuable skills that people can acquire is the ability to do that, whether that's interpersonal skills, whether that is specific technical skills relating to bringing ideas together. And where I think conduct comes into that is that this is inherently a pro-social activity. An intangible rich economy is an economy where trust, where interactions with other people matter more. And if you have two countries in that area, and in one is blessed with people who act better, who are more trusting and more trustworthy and have the kind of pro-social skills to do that, that country, that economy will do better. I think you're absolutely right as well that you can design perfect institutions, but if you don't, without good conduct, without kind of without a moral sense, all of that will be for naught.
Right, thank you very much. I have two questions here, up here in the front.
David Miles, Imperial College. Can I ask two very naive questions? If you look around a country like the UK, you say, what's the valuable things, what's the valuable assets that are now in? I suspect they are overwhelmingly houses, and cars, and computers, shops, and power stations, railways, ports. They're very, very tangible things. And I'm kind of skeptical a bit about whether that's really changed very much, although you're stressing how intangible capital. I think what's happened for a country like the UK, the same is true in the US, not in the UK, is where the things get produced, and we don't produce so many of the tangible things that we thought, because now, relative to 50 or 100 years ago, they're produced in other parts of the world, Taiwan and Korea and China and India, but not here. So that's the big change, not the composition of wealth of it. So that was my first question, would you agree with that? And the second bit was, I think you were sort of suggesting that there's difficulty, possibly market failures, in financing intangible investments. And I'm not sure that's quite true. As I said, this is partly devil advocate. When you look back at the dotcom boom and bust in the US, there was no problem with put money for it into investments in really intangible things. So,
Okay, so a couple of related questions. One on, the rise of the intangible, but also, what's changing on the tangible side that's influencing that, and then Romana. Okay, so then another one on the financing side, and so you talked about several institutions that had limitations. So very interesting question about the role of the financing and the elements that are blocking that, and then the other on the experimentation, which is also very. So perhaps we can address these sets of questions now.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks, Romana. Two really good questions. David, you're absolutely right that a lot of the sort of stock of wealth is indeed in these quite tangible things. I think what we're trying to say is at least two things. One is the flow is changing. That is to say, the additional investment that's coming is changing very much in its character. That's one thing. And the second thing is, part of the reason why I think houses are so valuable, as well as low real interest rates, which I know you've worked on, is the kind of agglomeration externalities that mean that living increasingly in clustered cities is extraordinarily valuable. I think that's and part of the reasons is because we've got a more intangible economy, and therefore those agglomeration externalities become more sort of salient. So I think that's what I'd say on that. You're right that there was lots of probably too much funding for the dot-com bubble. But I was saying earlier on, and I'm quoting Romana here, so please come and tell me if I miscalculate, if I misstate those kinds of things. That funding seems not to be able to work its way through to other types of funding, like climate-related funding and so forth as well. That's the first thing. And the second set of answers, Romana, if I may just very quickly. Yeah, sorry.
A comment on that, because I mean, one of the observations that you had may help also perhaps explain some of that, which is given that what you're observing and that what you mentioned that Romana did, which is how much you're relying on still on your houses to access your investments on the intangible side, means that that's still pretty important on that bit as well.
Yeah, so there's lots of evidence that intangible investment is sensitive not only to house prices, but also is very sensitive to kind of immediate cash flows, suggesting that there is something going wrong with the kind of funding which would otherwise smooth these things out. So, Romana, yes, I think there's just too little experimentation in this kind of area.
I mean, the other thing I would reflect on is comparing, say, the dot-com bubble in the late 90s with where we are now. There are some interesting applications of intangible capital that are happening now, enabled by the financial system, that seem to require more primary investment than was available back then. So an example that I'm quite fond of is Carvana in the US and Kazoo in the UK, which are effectively the kind of intangibilification, if you want, of the used car industry. So used car industry is obviously, a very old economy industry. It's got kind of some tangible assets and it sells physical things in a way that typically has not used a lot of software, has not involved a lot of brands and so forth. And my reading of something like Kazoo is a very large amount of venture capital ended up going into that. And, in some ways there was an exit through a SPAC and all these kind of things which wouldn't have been conceivable in the late 90s. And the story that you hear from talking to VC people is that it only worked because of that basically tsunami of money that Alex Chessman managed to unleash that actually pushed that over the line. So it feels to me that there is the bubble that burst in 2000 was in some ways small compared to the amount of money that's flowing in now. Now that doesn't disprove, maybe now that's the right amount of money, but there certainly is, it certainly has gone up in some ways. I mean, I think to the question that Romana raises, I think there's a kind of mixture of experimentation and potentially institutional change that's needed, because it appears that some of these things could at least be driven by the way we regulate financial institutions, the tax shields on debt. But as people like Daniel Davies point out, you could change all those rules and you would still need to grow institutions in the same way as you've written about the venture capital industry took 40 years to grow into its current form. So you probably need both, I think.
All right, I think we're coming to an end. So unless there is any kind of burning last, okay, all right, one last question.
One of the themes in the last book was lack of transparency. And I was just flicking through the new book and I saw that Baruch Lev got credited yet again in the introduction at the end of accounting, the fact that whatever David said about the question, still have 85% of enterprise value being intangible. Is it maybe your view that we need more transparency because what is not measured appropriately can't even be managed appropriately, and we still have report accounts just blocks of huge numbers being bought goodwill without any real understanding of what it is, what those
think there's just a question there.
Okay. All right. Two final questions.
The second question is a really hard question, so I'll leave that to Stian. Nigel, you're absolutely right. So people who don't know, Baruch Lev is a very well-known accounting professor at NYU, and he has written for years essentially on this issue that if we don't bother accounting for intangibles, those of you who've done even a little bit of accountancy will know this stuff is hardly measured at all. We have no idea what companies like Microsoft and companies like LinkedIn and those kinds of top companies we have no idea about what the assets are behind them. So absolutely more transparency.
The things that I think are most likely to make progress on are financial regulation of financial institutions and R&D funding. I think those are the things where we're sort of pushing at an open door or asking people to go further. Things that I think are hard and would be a kind of bloody and long battle are things like changing tax shields on debt. I think it's very important. I think some of the planning issues will be very tough to solve, but those are the big and important battles that I would pick.
Well, thank you very much for this discussion. I mean, one of the things that we try to do here at the business school is precisely the idea of, we have wonderful researchers pushing the understanding, and several mentions to that tonight about the research work that's been going on here on different directions. Also then bringing it back to the students and to the education. So how does it inform what we do in the classroom, but also creating this opportunity for engagement, to think about, what are the challenges that are out there, how can we learn from this discussion around these important topics? Because as you could see very clearly on this night's discussion, I mean, this is, one of the important areas where there's a fundamental change, taking place. There's a very, very engaging set of perspectives from these two, authors here today. But as you were ending now, there are very important questions that merit a very important debate. And this is also something that we see very important for our role as Imperial College Business School, is to create a platform for these very important discussions, because the solutions, the progress that we can or not make in some of these come out of thoughtful, exchange of perspectives, because they're thorny, because they're not going to be solved right away. And therefore you need to reason through and find, what are the steps so that you can find ways to make progress. So thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you for our authors, discussions, those that contribute to their questions, and the organization. Delighted to see you all in person or hybrid environments. And definitely a season that's changing, because I was running around from one physical event to another physical event coming here, which is definitely saying that things are evolving, although we still know that COVID is out there, as we can also see from tonight, the fact that our first speaker could not make it. And so for those that are still being affected by this disease, hopes of recovery, and that it doesn't have too much of an impact. So thank you, and enjoy the reception out. Thank you very much.